Hey, this is Paul Zimmerman, and today we're going to talk about Rose Rosette Disease. There's a lot of information out there about Rose Rosette Disease, and quite frankly to me, a lot of it's misinformation. Very scary, very spooky. Rose Rosette Disease is that sort of red witch's broom you sometimes see on your roses. And because there's so much misinformation, that's why I wanted to make this video. I've asked three friends to join me. Dr. David Byrne from Texas A&M University, Dr. Kevin Ong, also from Texas A&M University, and Dr. Mark Windham from University of Tennessee in Knoxville. All three are leading experts in their field. I did a Zoom interview with them, so quality might not be so good at some points, but you'll get the information. The audio is there. We've also included a lot of other visuals. And we basically went through Rose Rosette Disease. What's the history? How does it get in your garden? What does it look like? What can you do about it? And then we answered some questions that I got from people on my Facebook group page. One other note before we get started. There's no one sponsoring this video. I thought about it, but I thought, I don't think anybody should. I don't want the industry sponsoring, not that I'm against the industry, I'm in it, but I felt it was more important to not have a sponsor for the sake of the integrity of the video. So I'm doing this all on my own. It's self-funded, and I hope you enjoy it, and let's meet our guests. Before we meet the guys, I want to bring you up to speed on something we just learned about. The guys' research is funded through grants, and they didn't get that grant this year. So we're actually now going to use this video as a fundraiser to try to raise money to bridge their work until they hopefully get a grant next year. So at the end of the video, I'll come back and talk a little more about it. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate this. And obviously it's a subject that you all know quite a bit about. And I'm looking forward to giving you a platform to share this with everybody, all the rose lovers that are out there. So we have Dr. David Byrne. Say hello.
Howdy.
Dr. Mark Windham.
Howdy.
And Dr. Kevin Ong.
Howdy.
So thank you again for joining us. I appreciate this. So I think a good place to begin this conversation is just a brief history of Rose Rosette Disease. Where did it start? How did it kind of get here? What's just a brief history of it? And Kevin, you mentioned that's something that you think you'd like to tackle. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. So I love history. I like learning about how plants die. So I actually did a little bit of digging, and guess what I found? Rose Rosette, the first time it was reported, at least what was attributed to it, was in 1940. It took up 2 lines in a report of plant diseases in Canada. And so that was I believe, in the province of Manitoba, that it was described as witch's broom, possible virus. That was that first indication that, or what Rose Rosette Disease was attributed to. The next incidence or report that I could find was an article that was in the 1950s. And it basically referred back to reports of Rose Rosette. Well, they didn't call it Rose Rosette Disease back then. They said symptoms of witch's broom on roses, both in California and in Wyoming. And so those were the 2 earliest reports that I could find.
So Kevin, you mentioned it was first spotted back in, you said 1940, and then a couple sightings later. Where was that, where it was first spotted?
So in the second article where it mentioned potential Rose Rosette Disease-like symptoms, those were actually on wild roses in the northern part of California and parts of Wyoming. And you have to understand that I believe, if I recall, it was 1 or 2 counties that was butting up against Oregon on the north side of California in the mountains.
Okay, so this is not a new problem. So it's been here for like a good 80 years or something like that then.
It has been around for a while. And what was kind of interesting was there was not a lot of news about it between the 50s, and then you start seeing news bubbling up again around the 70s. So for a period of about 20 plus years, you really didn't hear too much about this particular disease.
I had read somewhere, or heard someone had told me they thought it could be cyclical. Dave or Mark, any thoughts on any of that? That it kind of comes and goes a little bit?
Well, where we have it in Tennessee, once it came, it stayed. I can't really say, but I have seen it's being very up and down. Certainly, though, some plants will look much worse in some years than they do in others.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Once it got into the Dallas area, it stayed, and it's just expanding from there. Unfortunately, as we look more, we find more.
Now we know a little bit of the history of Rose Rosette disease. It's been here since the 1940s, obviously a long, long time. It started in the West, it's moved east, and that's the next thing we want to talk about. How does it come into your garden? At the beginning of this video, I was standing in a field with some multiflora that had Rose Rosette disease. How does it transfer from there and get into my rose garden? I asked Mark to kind of start the discussion on this one.
Yeah. Rose Rosette is caused by a virus. The virus is Rose Rosette virus. It had been hinted at as a virus, then it was thought to be a phytoplasma, then it became a virus-like organism, then it became a virus again, and it wasn't until Xanatakis Lab in 2011 published a paper that put the question to rest. It is a virus, and it is called Rose Rosette virus. This virus is a bit unusual. It's a negative strand virus. That means that deals with how it replicates. And the key, though, is that this virus cannot move on its own. So it is very, very intertwined, I guess you would say, with its vector, which is a aerified mite, Phyllocoptus fructiphilus. So it's really more of a complex than it is just a virus alone.
So I know, and we know I know the mite causes it, and I'm glad you cleared that up exactly what it is and stuff. So how does it then travel from plant to plant? Or how does the mite travel from plant to plant? That's perhaps more of an aspect.
The mite has multiple ways that it can travel. One of the simplest ways is that if roses are intertangled with each other, which they are in production fields or in unpruned commercial plantings, the mite can travel from one plant to the next just by moving from one leaflet to the next.
Okay.
Because the plants will be intertwined. So that's one way that the mite can move. The second way that the mite can move is that it can become aerially dispersed. It can move in the air in wind currents. It's microscopic. It's not much bigger than a fungal spore. So it's very easy for the thing to be blown in air currents from one location to another or from one plant to another. Just like dust particles, the closer another bush is, the more likely it is to encounter mites moving from one bush to another one. So 6 feet away would be more likely to encounter mites coming from a source plant than one, say, 200 meters away. The third way that they can be moved is on plants from one location to another, and that is in transport. Whether it's from a Rose Society swap or a door prize, all the way up into commercial movement of plants would be a way. It is possible, Kevin can talk about this, he knows more about this than me. It has been detected in roots, so the mite can't move, but it's possible that the virus might also be able to move through root grass.
So historically with root transmission and viruses, so there has been reports that rose mosaic virus, which is a complex of several viruses, have been shown to be able to move from an infected plant to a new healthy plant and infect it through roots when the root graft together. At this point, we don't have a published report of Rose Rosette virus doing that. However, it is not impossible for Rose Rosette virus or to imagine that Rose Rosette virus couldn't do that. So I do have a graduate student currently working on that, and we are working on the presumption that that this virus has the ability to move through the roots when they're grafted together.
The last way that mite can be moved is sort of aerial, but the mite does not like rain or things like that, but aerified mites have been found on snowflakes. So there's all types of ways that they can be moved. It's possible that you could get some on your clothing and go to another rose garden and carry some that way. That certainly has not been published or proven, but I would say it's possible as well.
So first statement is it cannot fly, correct?
It does not have wings.
Okay, so it's an airborne.
Nor
airborne.
does it have eyes. It doesn't
Okay.
have eyes or a nose. So it's not sensing. It's moving more like a dust particle. If it doesn't land on a rose, it's going to die. So it most likely will try to disperse again until it gets to a rose.
And it needs the wind to obviously do that. So you say the one primary way it can move through from roses to roses is by wind. Is there like a distance that you say, okay, at this point the rose is far enough away from another rose that it can't be born, 100 feet, 200 feet? I mean, how far could it potentially be born by the wind, or is that unlimited because the wind is unlimited?
How far can a dust particle move?
And looking at my house, very far.
Yeah, absolutely. But if you throw dust up in the air on a windy day, most of the dust is going to be deposited in a relatively short distance.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that all dust particles have fallen out. Some may be carried much farther.
Right.
And that's the way it is with this thing. There will be a gradient. But that gradient does not mean that it just stops. People ask me all the time, is 200 meters far enough away? Is a half mile too far away? And what I tell them is how strong is the wind, and what the odds are less the farther you get away, but that mite is going to, a rose bush is going to encounter a mite from a point source.
Okay.
The other problem is there's not usually just one point source. There's multiple roses and multiple rose beds, and the wind can change, and you may have mites coming from a different direction.
Okay. So you mentioned briefly that, something that could happen is a plant swap or a plant sale or something like that. So if people are bringing roses into a plant sale, any tips on what they can maybe do to quote unquote disinfect the rose before they bring it into the plant sale to make sure the mites aren't present? I realize they can't do anything if the disease is already present, but to clean the mites out.
Kevin can correct me if
he probably will.
And I hope he does, because I'm a very much of a pessimist about it. There's always mites. Mm-hmm. Roses are going to have aerified mites. Roses most likely are going to have Phyllocopsis fructiphilus on it. The key is, are those mites carrying the virus? And to do that, they're going to have fed on a source of the virus before they move. You can't disinfect plants for mites, okay? But what you can do is make sure that bush is not exhibiting any symptoms of Rose Rosette Disease. That to me would be the key. And I'm going to hush and let Kevin correct me.
So one of the things that you want to keep in mind is Rose Rosette Disease is caused by the Rose Rosette virus. As Dr. Windham has mentioned, it's a negative strain RNA virus. And an RNA virus, you're going to find a number of flu type viruses, RNA viruses. Epidemiology of it is very similar in terms of, spread and how it sometimes causes disease. The difference here is the subject or the thing that it's causing disease to. So with Rose Rosette virus, all the questions about how far can it travel? There's so many other parameters that has to be considered because it does not move by its own power. It relies on other things, whether it's the wind, whether it's catching on a sort of a dust particle, or being taken up by the the Phyllocoppus fructiferous mite feeding on it, or so on and so forth. So do keep that in mind when you think about how to deal with Rose Rosette. Try and put yourself in the shoes of the virus so that you can try and predict how it might potentially move.
We've got a little history and we know how it spreads by that very specific mite that basically floats in the air currents. It can't fly. That's important to keep that in the back of your mind. So if it does get in your garden, and I hope it doesn't, the next thing to find out is what does it look like so you can recognize it and then proceed accordingly. Dave, why don't you pop us off on this one?
Okay. Well, a couple things. I mean, traditionally, and the very typical symptom is the rosetting of your shoots. So it's a witch's broom type thing that's very distinct in development of Rose Rosette. You do get smaller leaves, you get deformed flowers, you get reddening of shoots, as well as hyper thorniness. But the thorns aren't necessarily really stiff. They can be somewhat pliable. And so you get all those symptoms and everything in between, because not all varieties respond the same. So some that are extremely susceptible get these symptoms basically throughout the plant immediately, and others sort of in parts, in certain parts of the plant stay relatively symptomless. And then there's others actually that don't show any symptoms but have the virus, and we can talk about that later when we talk about resistance.
Okay.
So you get a whole wide range of different symptoms, and there's a good poster that Jen Olson put together showing different symptoms of Rose Rosette. When we first started the Rose Rosette project, she developed that poster and it's available on the internet. So that's always a good resource to get an idea of different symptoms.
Now that we know what it looks like, that witch's broom, that hyperthorniness, all those symptoms that'll help us recognize when it shows up in our garden. Hopefully it won't show up, but if it shows up, let me rephrase that. It's also important to know what it doesn't look like. It's often mistaken for herbicide damage when from spraying a thing like Roundup or something like that. It's also often mistaken for new growth. So we want to kind of tackle that and dive in a little deeper. And I'm going to ask Dave to start off with the herbicide question.
Disease.
Yeah, probably the biggest thing is you don't really get rosetting on the herbicide. You get finer leaves, more yellowish, and don't get the reddening or the hyper thorniness on the herbicide, especially Roundup. And I know when I first started looking at this, that's the first thing I would see. I said, oh my God, that must be Rose Rosette. And I talked to the grower and he said, well, and then I look at it and say, well, it's probably herbicide. And the guy said, no, it can't be because we don't apply herbicide, especially not Roundup. And then later I find out that across the road, they were applying herbicide on the fence line. Of course, that spread all over the roses. And so it sort of scares you when you first see that herbicide damage. But yeah, key is not the real reddening of the thorns or the shoot. You don't get a lot of thorns. And so it's just sort of very narrow leaves and yellowing of that shoot.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's what I see when I say herbicide damage. It's mostly, like you said, the leaves kind of shrivel up and they turn a little yellow, but you don't get that real pronounced red, hyperthorniness that you get with Rose Rosette disease.
Right.
So that's valuable. I think people are going to really want to know that. And the other thing I get a lot as well, and gentlemen, whoever wants to jump in, and I think for a lot of novice rose growers, Rose Rosette can be, it's kind of scary to them. And I'll get a lot of times people who are new to roses and they assume that all roses have green leaves, not realizing that a lot of younger shoots on roses are actually red. And so I'll get people posting and saying, is this Rose Rosette disease? And it's normal growth. So again, just maybe describe a little difference between, what's normal red growth going to look like and what's Rose Rosette disease growth going to look like. Obviously the thorniness and things like that, but maybe just sort of give some indicators on that.
Well, let me jump in on this.
Yeah.
So at the Texas Plant Disease Diagnostic Lab, usually in the springtime, we get quite a number of samples of people sending in roses that have these maroon or deep red shoots, and the question would come in, is this Rose Rosette? And a large percentage of the time, I would say almost 9 out of 10 times, we would have to reply back and said, no, this is just normal growth. And usually this is going to be one of those varieties that actually have new growth that is naturally red. So when you look at the symptoms where we said excessive reddiness or hyperthorniness, it actually makes good sense to look up the cultivar of the rose that you might have to actually understand some of its growth habit. Now, if it's not supposed to have reddish shoots in the beginning, then maybe you have a problem. But typically that will also be associated with abnormality in the leaf shape.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think what we can basically take away from this is just because a new shoot is red, don't assume it's Rose Rosette disease.
That is
Do a
correct.
little research, maybe ask other people who grow the rose, post it to a rose group or something like that. Ask your local rose society and say, is that normal for this variety?
Yeah, a lot of the breeding is going towards more colorful foliage as well, so you get a lot more red shoots in the newer varieties as well.
Paul, there's another thing. People are usually fertilizing their roses in the spring, and they're putting a nitrogen out in multiple forms. And when you have a lot of nitrogen in the soil, that often will keep those leaves redder longer than if nitrogen is not so high. And so often when people see this in the spring, they've applied a lot of nitrogen fertilizer. If they're rosarians, God only knows what kind of witch's brew of nitrogen, multiple nitrogens that they have applied. And so it's not unusual. And then the other problem is they see the small leaflets, the juvenile leaflets, and they think, oh, well, this must be because they're small, but they're just young. And so what I tell people is to look at the shape of the leaflet. Is it unusually long and thin, or is it just a small, naturally shaped leaf? And that often helps. But then there's one thing that hasn't been mentioned, but I deal with a lot of rosarians, and one thing rosarians do not like are blind canes. But blind canes do occur, and when they occur, they often are redder, and the leaves are fine. And then there's no hyperthorniness, there's no mouth-shaped leaves, there's just no flower bud. But people tend to forget about blind canes. And then the last thing, of course, is the holy grail to a rosarium, which is basal breaks. And so all of a sudden you'll get these fast-growing red shoots coming up, and this is what we want. This is how the rose renews itself. And yet a lot of people will send those in to me or send me pictures of basal breaks, and I'm just congratulating them on a good rose instead of diagnosing it as Rose Rosette.
Yeah, and just for some new rose growers who are out there, what Mark means by blind canes, blind shoots is the other term that you'll hear sometimes. And that's basically a cane that grows but does not produce a flower at the end. Right. And that's why it's called a blind shoot. So if people know. And basal breaks are, of course, new growth from the base of the plant. Those are going to become your next year's canes or canes in a couple of years. And as you mentioned, that's, as a rose lover, be still my beating heart when I see a basal break coming up. I'm beyond excited, popping the champagne at that point in time.
So now you know what it looks like, and more importantly, you know what it doesn't look like, which it does not look like herbicide damage or fresh, red, young growth. Now what do you do to prevent it? Is there a way to prevent it from coming into your garden? It's not going to be 100% foolproof, but there are some steps that you can take, and I'm going to let Mark start us on this one.
Yeah, the first fault is in prevention is to know what it looks like, to know what initial symptoms look like. Don't bring it home. In other words, if it's a cultivar you've been looking for 5 years, so somebody's produced a cutting, don't bring it home. The second thing, which I recommend to big rosarians that have a lot of roses, put the rose in a container for a year or two. Quarantine the things. Make sure that the things are healthy before you move them into your main garden. Would be another thing that you could do to prevent this thing. The third thing in prevention is also going to get into treatment later, is to prevent it, is to scout your roses in your garden on a regular basis. Now, for most people, that's not an issue. Why would you have roses if you're not going out and looking at them several times each week? But that doesn't always happen. And that's why it's a problem sometimes in commercial beds, because those things may not be inspected or looked at more than once or twice a year. But in the case of a gardener, you want to be looking. You want to catch this thing early, because if you can catch it early, you can then remove that rose, and that will prevent mites from that infected bush from then spreading to other bushes. So that's actually a form of prevention as well. And then the last thing that you want to do, as far as I'm concerned, on prevention, is to know the lay of the land. I had a gentleman in Middle Tennessee who moved in from San Diego. He planted 400 roses. He lost 200 in the first year. We looked in the edges of his woods that he owned, there was symptomatic multiflora rose all throughout that wooded area, right by where he planted his roses. So if he had inspected that and thought, oh gosh, my dog just went wild. If he had inspected those roses that were growing wild in his woods, he could have treated them with a herbicide, which he did after we found them, and then planted his roses, and he would have been okay.
And that relates back to what you talked about, which is the mite is mostly windborne. So if you've got a stand of infected roses upwind from your garden, then you're kind of setting yourself up for it in a way. And that's the be vigilant part.
Right now, we have not really identified any cultivars that is resistant. I do believe that tolerance, and I'm sure Dr. Burns can speak more about the different tolerance varieties. But then again, people will grow roses for certain traits. So I think it may be important to understand, like Dr. Windham said, lay of the land. If you know you're in an area that is has high disease pressure, then it may be wise to look at varieties that perhaps may be more tolerant to Rose Rosette and still have the similar characteristics in terms of color, scent, fragrance, or whatever that you might want.
Well, I think critical is just starting clean, and of course that's what the NCPN is all about, the National Clean Plant Network for Roses. And our major nurseries work with them quite carefully to get their material in, but there's always so a lot of their material is virus tested, and we're working to get more of the old garden roses and sources of old garden roses virus tested as well, so they're available as well, because a lot of the major growers are planting the commercial hybrid teas and now the newer shrub roses and things like that. So we're trying to expand that, and a lot of work that Kevin's doing with various people on that. So that's very important, just to start clean, and again, recognize, do your roguing. If you see it, don't let it continue in your garden. But with respect to the transfer, once you get it in there, you have to realize, as Mark mentioned, if you have a source near your garden, you're really in a bad situation. Remember when I was in Oklahoma looking at the plots with Jen Olson, she had planted some plots in the middle of a field. I mean, no roses nearby at all, except maybe about a half mile away. And within 2-3 months, she had symptoms of Rose Rosette. So given a prevailing wind, it moves extenstively.
So that begins to answer the question after how long can it travel. It's going to depend on the wind, so assume it can go far. I mean, I just a tale from my farm that I have a farm, and if I mow our fields on a regular basis, and I live in an area where wild multiflora just sees itself like crazy in the upstate of South Carolina, and I'm ever vigilant. If I see multiflora, even if it's healthy, I tear it out. But I came across a big stand of Rose Rosette and infected multiflora, and the first thing I did was got my tractor to drag it out of there and destroyed it. Because I generally know if I see it in my garden, the first thing I do is start walking upwind, because I have a pretty good idea that that's one of the ways it could have gotten in. So.
As we've learned up till now, recognizing it immediately is probably the best first line of defense. There are some preventatives that you can do. We talked about those as well. But if it does get in your garden, what do you do about it to prevent it from spreading to your other roses? Well, that's going to call for very swift and very decisive action.
What do you do if you have Rose Rosette disease? Well, once again, I know you can edit this. When somebody has it, the first thing they should do is say, "Damn, that day burns." But other than that, what? Other than that, the first thing that you should do is remove that bush. As soon as you see it, you need to remove it. I don't care if it's the last surviving clone of your great-great-grandmother's rose, and if it's gone, there are no more. Unless you want to take a chance of destroying the rest of your garden, get rid of the bush. It's not a grandchild, so get rid of the bush. The second thing, after you get rid of that bush, you obviously saw it on that bush, so the symptoms were fairly visible. Well, then I'm going to inspect every other rose that is close to that rose to see if it has milder symptoms, or if it's just beginning to display symptoms. Maybe there's not a rosette, but maybe there is distorted foliage, bent foliage. Maybe you're seeing right at the tip some hyperthorniness, and you say, and some roses have hyperthorniness right at the tips anyway. So you want to look at rose shoots that are that are asymptomatic foliage-wise, and make sure that they don't have it too. But I don't remove a bush with just one symptom. It's going to have multiple symptoms before I'm going to remove a bush. But when I do remove it, I'm going to look at all the bushes around it, because they're most likely the ones that are going to be infected next. So that would be the first thing that I would do, would be very aggressive about rogue.
So if you have an infected plant, you have to remove it immediately. What's the best and most sanitizing way to remove it to hopefully prevent it from spreading to other plants? Kevin, what are your thoughts on that?
So when you do remove a plant, you want to try and find ways to minimize the potential for the mite to get an opportunity to spread or to be blown off. So if you got a bag, if the plant's small enough to put a bag over while you cut it off, do so. If the rose bush is too big, then cut off the branches and stick it in the bag. We do not encourage you to burn the wood, because remember, heat is going to rise up, and that is going to help the mites lift off.
But mainly bag it and get it out of your garden as quickly as you possibly can.
And get it out of your garden.
I wanted to ask one thing and talk about one thing real quick. And Dave, I think maybe you can help with this. So, one of the things that's out there, they say if you have a rose that's got, 8 canes on it, for example, and you see Rose Rosette disease on one of the canes, if you follow all of you know where I'm going, you're laughing already. If you follow that cane to the base and cut it off at the base, can you prevent Rose Rosette from spreading into the rest of the plant?
Well, it's not the recommended approach, let's put it that way, because remember, the virus goes systemic. And so it's very likely it's in other parts of the plant as well, beyond where it's symptomatic. And so if you cut that one symptomatic plant shoot off and dispose of it properly, you still have a plant that possibly and most probably has that virus in it, and there's probably mites on it too. So eventually you're leaving a really good source of virus in your garden to infect everything else. So it's not the recommended way to do things.
So I think the takeaway from that is err on the side of caution.
Yes.
The minute you see it, if you get it, get the rose out of your garden via what Kevin described by bagging it, and don't try to save it by taking one cane down. You can always buy another rose.
So there's also a scientific explanation to that. We do know that Rose Rosette virus is found, primarily in the phloem, and so theoretically, when you think about it, in the phloem, where is it going to go first? It's going to go down into the roots. In terms of what my lab has done in terms of trying to detect it, what we found that detection in the crown of the root area seems to be, once we got a correct way to do it, we can consistently detect it in the roots. Now, does it come back up again? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But the fact of the matter is it's in the roots, and even though you cut off a cane right down to the soil line, the virus is still in the plant.
Yeah, and I think it's important too to remember to remind everybody that just because when your rose gets Rose Rosette disease, if it gets it, it's not going to manifest itself in 24 hours. It could take a while.
That's
so
correct.
It could have been in that plant for 3, 4, 5 months, 6 months, and has traveled all throughout the plant before you even begin to see it.
Paul, I do want to mention, we talk. You asked Dave about cutting, that one shoot out. There are times when that is actually a good idea. You look at your rose and you see Rose Rosette. You see a rosette beginning, and you've got to be at the airport in 2 hours, or maybe your back is hurt and you can't dig that plant out. We know that mite populations can be 40 to 50 times higher on that rosette than it will be on asymptomatic foliage on that same plant. So if there is a physical or a time limitation where you can't get that plant out of the ground right now, if you can cut that symptomatic shoot off, you will be removing a large portion of your viviparous mites at that time. And from an epidemiology perspective, that can be a really big deal.
And that comes back to the takeaway, act quickly and act decisively.
I hope that was helpful. Now I've got some history. You know how it spreads. You know how to recognize it. Very important to recognize it early. Some tips on how to prevent it. Also very helpful. And most importantly, what to do swiftly and decisively should you get Rose Rosette disease in your garden. That covers most of what I wanted to cover, but I wanted to take it a little bit further and get some questions from general gardeners. So I went to my Facebook group page, Paul Zimmerman Roses Gardening, and I asked, what do you want to know about Rose Rosette disease? So we're going to go basically now and answer some questions, sort of a roundtable format, and here we go.
Can you plant a rose in the same hole as a spot that a rose came out of that had Rose Rosette disease?
The answer to that is yes. How you do that, you want to make sure that you get rid of as much of the root ball as you can. And I would say let it sit for, depending on where you are, a month or 2 to see if there's any suckers that come out so you can get off the rest before you stick another one in there. It'll give you a better chance. If you don't have the time and you want to stick another plant right in there, again, there are no guarantees that it won't get sick, but the fact of the matter is, it is root grafting that we think that Rose Rosette can be transferred to. So a plant going right in there is very unlikely to root graft that quickly with a root that's not attached to another plant.
Do folks need to clean their tools after they remove a plant that had Rose Rosette disease?
Well, what you might have on your tools might be a few mites. So, that would be useful to make sure they're off. But with respect to virus, generally it's not a problem the tools will not transfer the virus from one plant to the other.
And also remember, Rose Rosette is not the only disease that gets on roses.
That's a whole new video, Kevin.
No, yes,
but no, it's not. It's important to what you asked. When people ask me that, I tell them, yes, you should clean your tools, but you're not cleaning your tools because you're worried about Rose Rosette. You're cleaning your tools because you're worried about moving crown gall. And so I always tell people they should be cleaning their tools, whether they're removing a symptomatic plant or not. It's so easy to spray some Lysol or use a Lysol wipe or an alcohol wipe. Why wouldn't you clean your stuff?
Yeah, so that again goes back to err on the side of caution. If you see it, get the plant out immediately. If you can't do it that day, get the cane out immediately at least, and clean your tools. And I think it was Dave, you talked about it. I can remember, think about how the mite could spread and try to, head it off before that even begins to happen. You always hear from a lot of people out there that are saying that they say knockout is the cause, or the knockout rose is the cause of Rose Rosette disease. Mark, I'd like you to address that one pretty much head on.
Knockout rose is susceptible to Rose Rosette disease, but there are many other cultivars that are just as susceptible as knockout roses. Knockout roses have been used in mass plantings in commercial beds, and these are often neglected most of the year. And the mite and the virus population can build up in a bed like that. But I have seen 2 massive plantings of the fairy rose near the State House in Columbia, South Carolina, that were 100% symptomatic for Rose Rosette. So it doesn't really matter what the rose is, it's how the rose is maintained. If you grow a lot of roses close together, you're not scouting them on a regular basis, you're not removing roses when they become infected, it doesn't matter which rose it is. And it doesn't matter if it's all one cultivar or if it's many cultivars that are being treated that way, that are mixed together. So knockout rose to me is no more of an issue. It's how it's been used.
So it's not the rose, it's how it's being used. And A is it how it's being used, and B is someone keeping an eye on it, which we talked about earlier about vigilance. And I've always said too, I think one of the things that we as Rosarians can do, and Rose Society and stuff, is be that vigilance in a public area. I know it's an awkward conversation to bring up to someone who owns a shopping mall that's mass planted with a rose of any kind, because that could be this culprit. But that can go a long way towards preventing it. Just saying, you've got it, here's what it is, let me educate you on it, let me educate you how to get rid of it. And that could begin to, hopefully not eliminate it, but maybe tamp it down a little bit. Dave, any thoughts on that?
Well, I would agree that, knockout, it's really how it's been handled. If you look at the varieties, and we've done extensive trialing for resistance among varieties to figure out which were susceptible, which ones weren't, looking at symptoms, and 96+% show very nice symptoms, which, from a plant pathologist point of view is great, from a grower point of view and a consumer point of view is awful.
Yeah.
But all the major commercial varieties are susceptible to Rose Rosette. The ones we're finding some resistance in are some of the older varieties, some species, a few newer ones that we need to verify because sometimes they aren't not well adapted. So it's kind of hard to determine whether the issue is lack of adaptation or Rose Rosette. But in any case, all the major varieties of roses are susceptible to Rose Rosette disease.
Are there certain areas of the country that you shouldn't buy roses from?
No. There is no relationship epidemiology-wise.
So does it affect younger or older roses? Dave, thoughts on that?
Yeah, it affects all ages of roses. We've had plots with Kevin in North Texas where within 2-3 months there was extensive Rose Rosette development. And of course, older roses will get it just as well. So no, it's not really age related. Everything is susceptible.
Question again, Kevin.
Is
it in countries other than the United States, Kevin?
At this time, we just know that Rose Rosette disease is found in North America, so Canada and United States. Rose Rosette-like symptoms have been reported in roses in China as well as in India, but there's no confirmation made on those things.
Mark, why is it in some parts of the United States but not in others?
I think there's 2 real quick, simple answers to that. There's definitely been a movement of this thing from west to east. So there are some parts of the country where it just may not have gotten to yet. Is one reason. The other reason is that the vector is a biotic organism. And there may be some parts of the country where it just doesn't thrive as well. And that's one of the things that we're having to look at now.
So are some varieties or classes more susceptible than others, Dave?
As far as I can see, they're almost, most of them are equally susceptible. We do have some less symptom development and things like that in some of the rugosa-derived roses. So that is one group that may have some more tolerance and or resistance to this disease. But here down in the south, they're not well adapted, so it doesn't help me too much. But up north, it might be something that might be useful.
So, Mark, does anything besides the very specific mite spread Rose Rosette disease?
There is no data that I'm aware of where any other mite or any other insect or animal is known to spread the virus other than Pilococcus fructiferum at this point. There are other aeropod mites on the plant, on roses that we know now. We used to not know that. And we know that now, but we don't know if they're involved or not. I don't expect them to be.
One of the questions I got was, if a rose shows signs of Rose Rosette disease, could you take a cutting from the part of the plant that's not showing Rose Rosette disease and expect that to be clean?
Expect it to be clean? No. To take a cutting from it, you could try and do it, but I would not recommend it. If that plant has shown symptom, you have to assume that it is infected. So even if you had the luck for that shoot to actually survive and root, you are very likely to have a diseased plant in your hand that can serve as a reservoir for that virus. And so it's better to err on the side of caution and just don't do it.
So, Mark, are there any biological controls such as predatory mites that might help with this?
There are some that might help. There is research going on at the University of Florida, the University of Georgia. I'm aware of a project at the University of Arkansas as well, where they are looking at this, but I haven't seen any data that would let me know that this is a thing that's going to work, but they are looking at it right now.
So stay tuned is the answer.
Stay tuned.
So, gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for joining me. I think we've gotten a lot of great information out. I think we debunked certainly some myths that are out there, and I think we've given some very clear-eyed information. But now I'm going to ask the $64,000 question that I think everybody's going to want answered. So Rose Rosette disease is in this country. It's been here now, as Kevin mentioned, since the 1940s. We now know how to deal with it, be vigilant, get it out of your garden as quickly as possible. But here's the question. Because of Rose Rosette disease, should gardeners stop growing roses?
My answer to that is no, they should keep trying to grow roses. I think it's going to be challenging in certain parts, but I think it's going to be enriching when you actually can grow really beautiful roses.
By all means, people should be growing roses. There's no reason to stop. If you are vigilant, most parts of the country are going to be able to manage this thing quite well. Even in places where it is more difficult, the loss of roses is still the exception in most gardens instead of the constant thing. If you see an issue, get it out. Don't let it become a large rosette before you act, and you'll be fine.
Of course not. That's sort of the spice of life in your garden. You got to keep going, and as Mark says, be vigilant. If you have it in the area, keep reviewing your roses, see if you have any, and as soon as you see it, get rid of that plant. And you'll be able to, as long as you're vigilant, you can maintain a good rose garden even in the presence of Rose Rosette.
Yeah, I mean, my personal experience is I've grown hundreds of roses in my garden here over the years. And have I gotten a Rose Rosette? Yes, I've gotten it. But I always tell people I've lost more plants to winter kill or to voles than I've ever lost to Rose Rosette disease. And that's never stopped me from growing roses. So I'm completely with you. It's there. Be vigilant. Keep an eye out for it. But we keep an eye out for other things with our roses and all of our plants as well. So stay tuned, but absolutely don't stop growing roses.
Oh, remember one last thing about that. When you lose a rose to Rose Rosette, that is an opportunity to bring in a new rose that you didn't have.
which is next to basil breaks, probably the most happy thing a rosarian can do.
Exactly right.
I want to wrap this up by taking a few moments to thank Kevin and Dave and Mark for so freely sharing their wisdom and their knowledge and everything they've learned over the years. And I hope it's helped you. I hope it's taken some of the mystery out of Rose Rosette disease. And there's a great website for current information called roserosette.org. More importantly, at that site, you can report incidents of Rose Rosette disease in your own garden. That helps the research kind of track how it's spreading and learn more about it. And I'm just going to leave you with this. You know, I've gotten Rose Rosette over the years. I'm in the upstate of South Carolina. It's a hot spot. You know, I'll probably get it again, but you know what? I'm not going to stop growing roses, and neither should you.
I hope you enjoyed that, and we certainly had a lot of fun making it. As promised, we're using this video to raise funds for Kevin, Mark, and Dave's work. Basically, essentially, what we're looking to do is to try to help fund the two gardens, research gardens that they have. There's 10 years worth of work into those two gardens. There's one, Mark has a garden at University of Tennessee, and of course, Dave and Kevin have one at Texas A&M. About $100,000 per garden to keep them going during a year. That's labor, maintenance, materials, you name it, all the things that go in a garden. You go to gardeners, you know how much time and effort goes into it. So that's what we're looking to raise. We're using a site called GoFundMe Charity. You can see the link on the screen right now. And there's also a button above me that you can click on to go there as well. It'll be there till the end of the video. We're doing this through the American Garden Rose Selections. Why? Because they're a nonprofit. And that way all the money goes through them. They have a treasurer. It's all very transparent, and that's the whole thing. It goes into a special banking account, and then 50% goes to Kevin and Dave's garden. So that's what we're trying to do. So we hope that you will donate. In fact, please donate. This is vital research. You've met the guys. You can see how passionate they are. And you certainly know how passionate I am. So please click on the link, and we hope you make a donation. Thanks a lot.